today in Rich in Relationship. We're going to talk about compassion fatigue, or why it seems like people just don't care like they used to. Compassion fatigue is what we experience when violence becomes the norm. If you're using screens to control your emotions, then you, through screens, are also controlling your conflicts. Welcome to another episode of Rich in Relationship. I'm your host, Rich Heller, and today we are talking about compassion fatigue, or why it seems like people just don't care like they used to, particularly your partner. And I'm here to tell you that a lot of it has to do with what we are consuming on screens. It seems innocent enough. We're just watching stuff. Why does it make a difference? Well, first, let me give you some statistics. All right, this is from the federal government, actually. It's from the National Health The National Library of Medicine is who it's from. One of the notable changes in our social environment in the 20th and 21st century has been the saturation of our culture and daily lives by mass media. Research evidence has accumulated over the past half century that exposure to violence on television, movies, and most recently on video games increases the risk of violent behavior on the viewer's part, just as growing up in an environment filled with real violence increases the risk of violent behavior. Are you feeling what I'm saying here? Why is it that what we watch, what we consume, has such an influence on how we act and feel? And what does this have to do with they just don't care? Let's start with how they are now and how they were then. When you first met and you fell in love, you were investing mad time into the relationship. You were firing on all 5 love languages, probably gifts, acts of service, quality time, words of affirmation. And I feel like I'm missing one. Touch, of course. Touch, all that was going on. You're both speaking all 5 love languages to each other. It's a love language festival. You're spending a lot of time investing in the relationship because you're in love. Everyone around you supports you in being in love. You get married, you have kids. Years later, not only are you not in love, but you seem more distant than you ever imagined you would be from your partner. What happened? Well, one of the things that happened is where your attention went. If one or both of you is spending an hour to 4 hours a day on screens, you're consuming high levels of sexual content and violent content. Just statistically, you got to be. Why does that make a difference? I'm not trying to be religious here. Let's be scientific. We are 80% unconscious mind. Our unconscious mind is like a sponge. And just like that piece I read to you, when we watch a lot of violence, it's almost as impactful as being in a violent environment. And the reason is our unconscious mind does not distinguish well between what is imagined and what is real. And so when we are participating in an imaginary world that has violence, it's as if we were living in a violent place. And when we do that every day for an hour to 4 hours a day, that experience in our unconscious mind builds and builds and builds. And our unconscious mind starts to adopt the behaviors that we're watching. It starts to see that as the norm, and we start acting that way. And what happens, let's just stick with violence. What happens when we're watching a lot of, even if it's not actual beating, it's just angry people, is we start to mirror that in our interactions, particularly with the person that we feel safest with, which is our partner. And our partnership relationship becomes polluted by what we're consuming. Compassion fatigue is what we experience when violence becomes the norm. It becomes the norm because the reason why there's compassion fatigue when violence becomes the norm is because violence triggers a part of our brain, fight, flight, or play dead. We live in a constant state of adrenaline. We live in a frequent state of adrenaline, a frequent state of being triggered, a frequent state of being on guard, and being in a survival mindset. And intimacy is not grounded in a survival mindset. Intimacy is grounded in the sense that there is safety and security. Intimacy is grounded in the sense that all of our needs have been cared for. Intimacy is grounded in an environment where two people are consciously working at helping one another. Intimacy, this desire to be vulnerable is what we're talking about, is grounded in a no judgment zone or a low judgment zone. In a triggered state where we're watching a lot of violence and experience a lot of violent emotion while we're watching it, we identify with what we're seeing on the screen. We invest ourselves in it. We can't be in that space. And consequently, when we're driving and we see a homeless person, instead of going, oh, wow, that must be so hard, we go, I better look the other way because I don't want to interact with this person. I might want to give them something, and I don't believe in giving homeless people money. When there might be a compassionate middle ground that we could walk with that. But when we're in that state of survival, it's like, well, I got to take care of me and mine, and that person, that's a threat. So I'm going to ignore it or kill it. Very simple, right? The truth is that when we're in a survival mindset, values that are important to us get thrown out the window because there is only room for those values when we feel safe. Now, there's a whole podcast I can do about how we might be in a situation that seems like it's about survival and still feel safe, but that's a whole nother podcast. All right, let's look at the other side of this. So we've been looking at compassion fatigue, which is basically emotional exhaustion from excessive exposure to distressing content. It might be the news. If you're watching the news all the time, I've gotten into this thing right now that we have an agent of chaos in the White House, which is driving a lot of change. I'm not saying I think chaos is cool. I think change is awesome. So we've got a president in the White House who's all about change. I'm watching the news every day, just looking for, all right, what's going to happen now? But for a lot of people, watching the news is like, oh no, look at what's happening now. Everything's changing. What am I going to do? We might be in a state of emotional exhaustion from watching entertainment that's distressing. Maybe we're watching a lot of really dark television, a lot of dark content where I wonder, for example, about content where we see into the mind of Hannibal Lecter and start to understand what it's like to be a sociopathic cannibal. I wonder if that's really good for us. I wonder if watching a lot of horror shows, which used to be, horror, Boris Karloff, and it used to be about Frankenstein, things that we didn't feel very connected to reality. And now horror feels very like it could happen in my house when I watch it instead of something kind of distant and far away. Vampires and Frankensteins, kind of distant and far away. Sociopaths rampaging around with hockey masks and chainsaws, a little close to home in some ways. Maybe we're experiencing exhaustion from what we're watching, what we're reading, or maybe we're just experiencing emotional exhaustion because we're actually in survival mode. We're having trouble feeding our family, and that's got us into survival mode. And then we add all the screen time on top of it. What happens is like what happened with Brad and Gwen. Gwen started out at the in-love phase, feeling like she was the most important person in the world to her husband, Brad. But now he kind of zones out when she talks and she doesn't understand why. And he's not a bad husband. He loves her, but he can't express it because he's emotionally maxed out. Brad gets his excitement going out and watching football games with the fellas and drinking a bunch with them. When he's home with Gwen, he's just doing what he thinks he's supposed to be doing to get along. He's not fully present. He can't wait to get back into football season, very violent sport, or watching the movies that he likes, or any of the things that keep him fired up, keep his adrenaline going. That's where he is. If your emotional energy is being drained by screens, the question I want to ask you is, what's left for your relationship with yourself, much less your relationship with your partner? Now, let's talk about another way that we get desensitized. We've been talking about pornography and the impact that it has. And I'm going to tell you, as a man of a certain age, when I was a kid, we used to watch television. Sex was suggested at, but never acted out. There were things that people said in movies that told adults that they were talking about sex, but if you were a kid, you didn't really get it. And over time, by the time I was a teenager, sex was kind of a regular thing on television. And now, when I watch television, things that used to be censored out because it was too explicit for television is now present. I mean, basically, the stuff that I see on Netflix or Amazon Prime has what used to be R-rated sexual content bordering on X-rated sexual content. It used to be that to get for a movie to be rated X it wasn't that hard. They basically had to be doing it and naked. And a lot of the content I'm seeing on Netflix and Amazon Prime, for example, people are doing it pretty straight up for minutes, long minutes. When I was a kid, that would have been rated X and for adults only, and now it's out there for everyone. Well, I'm not telling you that that's bad. It's bad to watch this stuff. But the studies show that sexual content has risen dramatically. Not only are our children seeing this stuff because we don't monitor what they're watching, but we're seeing it all the time. And if you remember from the previous episode, every time a guy sees a sex scene, he gets a dopamine hit from it. It becomes very addictive. I'm not sure. For some reason, men have a different relationship with pornography than women. Women seem to be hooked on something different. My prediction is that it's going to be relationship with an AI, but they may really like these movies too. I don't know if it's a movie, maybe they're getting a hit out of it that way. Now, I've worked with people who have problems with pornography. Not my favorite thing to do, but I've done it. And what they tell me is that pornography, or really what we're talking, let's throw out the P word. What they tell me is watching people have sex in ways that they didn't imagine actually lessens their sex life. In the last episode, we talked about how watching social media can lessen your experience of your marriage. You're seeing other people's best moments and comparing them to your worst. Well, watching someone's best imagined sex scene, and they're acting these out for film, they're not real, and comparing it to your sex life can have the same effect. And so what I'm telling you is you can have connection fatigue from all the sex that you're watching. And I'm not trying to tell you to be a puritanical. I'm telling you want to be very careful about what you consume when it comes to violence and sex. And I'm telling you that because you didn't get married to have fantasy relationships with screens. You got married to have a real partnership. And the way that we're using screens and the content that's being offered to us as screens, most of it supports fatigue, withdrawal, fantasy, and a very slim percentage of it supports personal fulfillment, growth, and partnership, which is what we're all about here. So what I'm encouraging you to do is to reclaim your emotional energy. First, you got to tune down your amygdala. The first thing is reduce your exposure to hyper-emotional content. Choose uplifting, meaningful media instead. Media that is in alignment with your goals for yourself and for your marriage, for your children, and for your family. Don't just watch it because it's titillating, exciting, or thrilling. Boundaries. Limit how much violence you see in the week, and do not watch violent content before bed because your unconscious will take that to bed with you. Don't doom scroll during quality time. Prioritize real emotional engagement over passive digital consumption. Brad and Gwen actually took a 7-day break from negative media. They only got on screens for work purposes. And they immediately noticed more energy and warmth between them. Actually, the truth is, for the first couple of days, they were super uncomfortable. Because when our from being adrenaline driven to more rational to talking and processing rather than just being emotional, there's an uncomfortable transition period there. But once they made it through that uncomfortable transition period, once they detoxed from screens, they were able to be more present for each other. And they're much more careful about their use of screens today. If screens are controlling your emotions, or really if you're using screens to control your emotions, then you, through screens, are also controlling your conflicts. How do we keep digital misunderstandings from escalating into real relationship problems? So next episode, we're going to talk about navigating digital conflict and miscommunication. We're going to move a little bit from what we consume and how we consume it to how we use screens in communication and how we can use it to avoid gridlock, is what we call it here, destructive conflict, and to build synergy or creative transformational resolution of differences. If you're feeling drained and disconnected, it's time to reset. Get practical strategies to restore emotional synergy and rekindle intimacy at our website, richinrelationship.com. And in the meantime, have a wonderful day and an awesome tomorrow.